I'd like to welcome everyone to MTRI's October Sit Back Seminar. But before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that we are meeting here today in Gespewick, one of the 7 districts of Mi'kma'ki, homeland to the Mi'kmaq people. We want to acknowledge the treaties of peace and friendship and thank the Mi'kmaq people for their generosity in sharing their homeland with us. So to anyone who hasn't heard of MTRI before, we are a research-based nonprofit nestled in Southwest Nova Scotia near Kejimkujik National Park and Historic Site. And our mission is to promote, conserve, and sustain biodiversity in Gespewick, as well as beyond into the rest of Nova Scotia. So for today's talk, I would like to introduce Dr. Mike Gill, Director of the Biodiversity Indicators Program at NatureServe. His research focuses on applications and testings of the essential biodiversity variable framework and related concepts for the design and scaling of biodiversity observation systems. After Mike, we will be hearing from Cliff Drysdale, the Vice Chair of the Southwest Nova Biosphere Reserve, and he will join us to talk about the reserve, its principles, development, and the Open Science Nova Scotia Interactive Atlas project. So as a quick reminder to everyone, if you have questions during our talk, you can type them in the chat window or wait until the end, and the presenters will get to them as they see fit. So Mike, if you want to start.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for the introduction. So my name's Mike Gill. I've been living in Nova Scotia for 6 years now. I'm from the West Coast, but I moved here from the Yukon. I married somebody from the Maritimes. And so once you marry someone from the Maritimes, you're pretty much, at some point, you're going to be moving here. So I live here now in Canning. And as Chad said, I'm a conservation scientist. Actually, this talk came about because I ran into Chad and his colleague when I was walking into Long Tusket Lake there, just behind Weymouth, and we met and had a bit of a quick discussion and led to this seminar. So what I was going to do is just talk a little bit about the work that I do, and it kind of blends between my role at NatureServe, where I run a Biodiversity Indicators Program, where we help different countries around the world build what we call data decision workflows and decision support tools, to my elected role as co-chair of a global network called GeoBon, or the Group on Earth Observations Biodiversity Observation Network. And actually, I just came off a call because we just went through the process of electing the new co-chairs going forward. So I've been doing it for 2-3-year terms, and my terms are up now. So we've just elected someone from Colombia and someone from Canada to take over the global network. But I'll talk a little bit about that. So just to give you a sense of what I'm going to cover, we'll talk a little bit about the challenge that we face globally with regard to, I'm sure everyone knows that we're entering the 6th extinction crisis, and yet we actually have very limited intelligence about what's really happening on the ground, not just in Canada, but globally, in terms of limited quality and quantity of data, and how we actually deliver that data to make better conservation decisions. And based on that challenge, what the network that I co-chair is doing, GeoBon, in terms of organizing a more cohesive way for replicating biodiversity observations around the world. And then I'll kind of get out of that boring stuff and talk about some of the exciting new technologies that we're already employing for monitoring biodiversity around the world, and how we actually build that and stitch it together to inform sort of more rapid, real-time, and even predictive conservation actions. And then I'll try and step it back down to talk about just how local people armed with the smartphone are now actually networked into a global system for biodiversity observations, and how when you go out and do an eBird observation or take a picture through Inaturalist, what happens to that data and why that's so important. So I'm sure no one on this call is surprised that we are in a biodiversity crisis. The latest Intergovernmental Panel on the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services predicts that in the next 50 years, there's about 1 million species at risk of extinction. We've lost about 2/3 of global forest cover, although there are some areas where forest cover is improving, like in Vietnam. But most of the Earth's surface has been touched by people. So we've got 3% of our oceans untouched. The latest Living Planet report shows that we've lost since I was born in 1970 about 66% of our vertebrate species, so fish, birds, and mammals and reptiles. And a report that we just released called the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook report, which reflects on the last 10 years of the global targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity. The nations have failed to reach any of those 20 targets. We've failed across the board, across all 20 targets. So we're really in a massive crisis in terms of biodiversity, and we're failing to respond well to it. And because of that crisis, of course, coming out of 1992 and a Rio Convention, there was the Climate Change Convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity. There's been a whole host of multilateral environmental agreements that Canada signed on to. There's the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals, and they all call for action around sustainable development, around biodiversity conservation and restoration. And they all come with targets. So countries, when they sign on to these things, commit to targets such as the Aichi biodiversity targets, the sustainable development goals. And each one of those targets requires data to produce what we call indicators to actually track progress globally, but also on national scale. So there's huge demand for data. And yet, the data that we have on biodiversity is incredibly poor. And this, of course, doesn't include the oceans, which are even worse. But if you look at global coverage of things like Living Planet Index, vertebrate population trends, not surprisingly, you see a concentration of data in North America and Europe, and the rest of the world is pretty poor, and there's a lot of gaps. And when you overlay diversity across the planet, at least terrestrial diversity, the areas that are actually richest in diversity are the poorest, typically, in terms of observations. And this is why we're working in places like Colombia and Brazil and Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia to try and turn that around. So the areas that are undergoing the most rapid change, like Indonesia, Colombia, Brazil, have the least amount of data and yet harbor the most species, at least terrestrially. And if you look, of course, biodiversity is not spread thinly and evenly across the landscape. So about 43% of all bird, mammal, reptile, amphibian species occupy about 2.4% of the Earth's surface. So we have what we call biodiversity hot spots around the planet that typically are not well protected. And we need to come up with ways that we can actually understand and identify those areas and come up with ways that we can actually more effectively protect them. And beyond this, if you look at our understanding of diversity writ large, not surprisingly, on the left there is a representation of just what percentage of the roughly 8.7 million species are found in different taxonomic categories. So it's mostly invertebrates, it's mostly insects and related invertebrates. And it's just a fine sliver that are vertebrates and plants and things like that. But then when you look at what we actually measure and assess, which you can see on the right-hand side, and this is the Red List Index that's produced by IUCN, we largely focus on birds. So birds are well covered in terms of biodiversity assessments, followed by amphibians and mammals. We know very little about what is mostly found on this planet. So there's a major set of taxonomic gaps. And now looking ahead, a lot of the drivers of biodiversity historically were more local scale. So they might have been overharvest of a particular species or population, but more and more we're seeing sort of these global drivers of biodiversity loss. And the most famous is climate change. And if you look at the latest figures coming out of the IPCC report, it's pretty sober. So we have a Paris Agreement that's trying to hold the world at 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. But 2 degrees Celsius is actually quite a disaster for biodiversity as we know it. It's very much high risk vulnerability at that scale of warming for warm water corals, small scale low latitude fisheries, which millions and millions of people rely on, say goodbye to Arctic sea ice and related ecosystems, and on it goes. And so there's been a push towards focusing at getting us down to 1.5 degrees. But right now, if you look at the nationally determined contributions around the planet, if every country does what they say they're going to do, our planet will be between 3 and 4 degrees warmer by 2100. So we're falling massively short, and we're talking about the basically planetary boundaries that will be crossed. And so whatever we do for biodiversity is pointless if we don't actually deal with the climate crisis. But actually, vice versa, you can't actually solve the climate crisis without dealing with biodiversity protection. So if you look at what it takes for the world to hold steady at 1.5 degrees warming, actually 2/3 or 37% of the actions required come from what we call natural climate solutions. So these are protecting high carbon rich landscapes and restoring huge amounts of the planet that have been degraded over time. So they're really two sides of the same coin, and we can't actually do one without the other. And of course, we're doing this talk over Zoom, and this COVID-19 or COSARS-2 is a biodiversity story, and it's something that was predicted. I work with a group called EcoHealth Alliance that looks at pandemic risk across the planet, and they've been predicting these pandemics for some time, in particular coming out of China. And if you look at the last 100 years and you look at fairly major spillover events of animal diseases to humans, the most common feature is land use change. So in areas of high mammalian diversity, with a lot of people undergoing rapid land use change, are the recipes for spillover events because you have increased fragmentation of habitat. You have more people coming into contact with biodiversity, and species such as bats host about 3,000 different types of coronaviruses around the world. And up until recently, we were not typically exposed to them. But as transmission rates and exposure goes up, the chance for the virus to become more contagious increases, and you get these spillover events. And what we know about this current pandemic, it's highly related to the SARS virus that came out, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, which came out in the 2000s, and that originated from a horseshoe bat, which jumped to, at that time, masked palm civet cats, which are, and both species are heavily traded in China. So civet cats are farmed, and they became the intermediary hosts, which then passed on to humans. And if you look at where this particular virus originated, and the fact that it's genetically about 96% similar to the original SARS virus, it's almost for sure come from a horseshoe bat. And we think it jumped to a pangolin. And a pangolin is a mammal that's the most heavily traded group of species on the planet in terms of trafficked species, which jumped to humans. So everything we do in terms of degrading habitat and trafficking species has a huge impact. So basically, by allowing further erosion of habitats in Southeast Asia and allowing sort of fairly unregulated wildlife trade in this part of the world, we're all sitting at home, we're wearing masks, there's trillions of dollars off the table of the economy. So clearly biodiversity matters, and we really need to get this message out. So with all those major drivers and all those challenges, the network that I run is basically trying to come up with ways that we can improve what we call the acquisition, coordination, and delivery of biodiversity observations. So we're trying to improve the spatial coverage of data collection around the globe, both on the ground and using sort of airborne and spaceborne techniques. and really come up with more interoperable or replicatable ways. So think of us like the climate community. So everyone around the world has agreed to how they measure temperature, how they measure barometric pressure, humidity, and so on. And we all take that for granted. But there was a time when people did that differently. And they, over some course of decades, the world negotiated something called the essential climate variables. And now every country around the planet has signed on to what they call the ECVs. And so we measure climate in a consistent way. And that allows us to model and predict climate change and have super accurate weather. And we design all our spaceborne instruments around the ECVs to collect those things. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with biodiversity. We're trying to come up with a more coherent, agreed way that we can actually monitor biodiversity across scales, simply because biodiversity knows no boundaries, and much of the change in biodiversity now is coming from these global forcings like climate change. So this GeoBond is one of 9 what we call societal benefit areas. So it's an intergovernmental organization. So we have about 105 nations signed up to GEO and GeoBond. It's made up of all the major space agencies like Japan Space Agency, NASA, European Space Agency, and so forth, which came together to say, we got to coordinate more about what we're throwing into orbit. So we don't need to be having all this redundancy in terms of what we put as sensors into space. And from that came this agreement in 2005 to come up with the Group on Earth Observations, which is a way to coordinate Earth observation from space, but also on the ground across the planet. And so I co-chair the biodiversity component of that. And you can see it's a global partnership. We've got about 200 different organizations. So this is just a snapshot of some of them. And we're all working together to actually coordinate on the ground observation approaches in Colombia, in Canada, in Europe, in Brazil, Asia, Africa, and so on and so forth. And we have members around the planet. I won't say much more about that. And like I said, we're trying to copy the climate community by defining something called the essential biodiversity variables. So we're trying to simplify how we understand how ecosystems and biodiversity work by basically breaking it down into the minimum set of measurements complementary to one another that can capture biodiversity change. So we have essential variables for genetic composition, species traits, species populations, ecosystem structure, ecosystem function, ecosystem services, and so on. And by defining that, we can actually simplify a means by way you or anyone else, say the Mersey Tobiatic Research Institute, collects data. That data then becomes has a pathway to become interoperable and be used into a global system. And I'll talk about sort of how we do that. And then from that, we can compile and aggregate all these data sets and use sort of big data machine learning techniques to really start to understand and model how the Earth's likely to change over the coming decades under different scenarios that we can then inform governments on how they might want to change their approach. So we're working around the world. I established the Arctic Biodiversity Observation Network. So this is an operational network operated through the Arctic Council. So it's coordinated through the 8 Arctic Council countries. We've got networks forming throughout the Americas. So this slide's actually a bit old. We've helped China set up their systems. We've got one through Asia Pacific. And we've got some other ones that are forming in parts of Europe and in sub-Saharan Africa as well. And so anyway, so that's kind of the boring stuff, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the new techniques that we're actually monitoring the pulse of the planet and how this actually kind of increases our power and lowers our cost. So first off is Landsat. So Landsat's a NASA constellation of satellites, and it's been going since the 1970s. So this is what, if you took like a 1975 Landsat image of the Earth's land cover, this is what you get. in 1975. But successively, they've been launching higher resolution um, satellites in the Landsat constellation over the years. And so this is what 1 pixel would look like. It would just basically say, this is 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer forest cover. It wouldn't tell you much about whether that forest was degraded, whether it was fragmented, and so on and so forth. But if you start to look over time, the resolution got better and better and better and better. So this is an area near Washington, D.C. And now we've got like 30-meter resolution Landsat imagery where we can actually detect globally, almost daily, forest cover change. So when the Ministry of Lands and Forestry unfortunately allows those clear cuts in the Silver River area, the Landsat constellation will pick that up. And we have cloud computing through something called the Global Forest Change Program that will actually immediately identify that loss of forest cover. And so this is through a colleague at the University of Maryland that's created this global forest change data, and we can actually surveil the entire planet's forest cover on an almost daily basis. And actually, some countries are using this to stop illegal tree poaching, such as in Brazil and Russia. And of course, this is just, there's more and more satellites going up, probably too many. This is just an example of some of the NASA Earth observation satellites. Because most people think about NASA as, going to Jupiter and other star systems, but they have a really robust Earth observation program. And all these satellites produce incredibly important data. And what's nice about organizations like NASA is they support these systems over the long term. So you get long-term time series trends, in particular with Landsat. They made all that data freely available, which has really revolutionized how we can actually monitor and observe the planet. And we can do things like this. So we can look at tree cover loss and tree cover gain over time, or weekly, daily, over decades, and so on and so forth. And if you look on this map, actually, Canada is one of the fastest deforesting countries on the planet, which a lot of Canadians probably wouldn't think that we were doing that. But up until recently, oil and gas development in the boreal forest has been driving pretty rapid forest loss in Canada. And of course, Brazil's another bad one, parts of Indonesia. But in places like Nova Scotia, at the coarse scale, you actually see forest gain. Not saying anything about the quality of that forest. It's a lot of plantations, a lot of, softwood being replaced from Acadian forest. But you can start to actually monitor the Earth's forests using these types of approaches and techniques. And now with cloud computing, whenever these satellites, so right now overhead of us, there's petabytes of data being collected from Earth observation satellites. And most of it is completely useless to us because we never actually validated or ground truth that data. So we've all this data. It's the classic thing where tons of data, no wisdom. And but we're starting to find new techniques through cloud computing where you can actually speed up by using things like Google Earth Engine, where you actually grab computing power from computers all around the world to actually analyze images. So here you can actually take all these different composite images from Landsat of this part of Indonesia, and you can use a cloud computing algorithm to basically generate a cloud-free composite image of this part of the world. And that's really hard to do because Indonesia is constantly covered in cloud. So we allow these satellites to continually image these particular parts, and we use cloud computing to actually crank out over a short time window what's actually happening on the ground. And that's really useful for detecting like illegal logging and protected areas and things like that. And then we also use satellites now to count animals for space. So you can count elephants from imaging satellites. You can count penguins just simply because they're dark and they sit on snow, so they're fairly easily detectable. And we use like algorithms to actually train the computer to stop calling a rock a penguin. But we actually, so this is an image from space of an emperor penguin colony in Antarctica. And we actually also image their guano or their poo. So we can actually count how many colonies there are across Antarctica and see whether they're increasing or decreasing in size. And you can look back historically with Landsat data to say, oh, there's actually more or less penguin colonies over time by just looking at the poo scarring on the ice. And the good news with penguins is there are actually more penguins than we thought. And it's simply because you can't really get around Antarctic easily to count penguins. And then some other fun ways that technology's helped us is, of course, geolocators, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. So these are little tiny devices that basically all they do is they record the time of sunrise and sunset every day. And you can put them on, because they're so tiny, you can put them on fairly small birds and other animals that migrate. The trick to these is you got to catch the animal again and take that geolocator off and download the data. But it's really revolutionized our understanding of migrating wildlife, because when you put these things on small animals, you realize just how incredible these animals are. They're basically the most incredible athletes on the planet. So if you look at like bar-tailed godwits, which they breed up in Alaska and they winter in Australia, we knew that was a long trip, but we always assumed that they kind of went along the Russian coast and down and stopped along Japan and so on and so forth. But after putting geolocators on these animals, we realized that these animals fly nonstop from Alaska to Australia. They don't actually land. So they fly 11,500 kilometers without stopping, which is, I'm pretty sure, rivals any commercial jet airliner in terms of distance. And now with the International Space Station, NASA's putting up all sorts of cool instruments. So there's one's called the JEDI, which is something I use quite a bit. So it's just a play on name. So it stands for Global Ecosystem Dynamics Instrument. So it's just a laser. So it shoots a laser down continually on the planet. You can use that to measure what we call vertical structures. So how tall forests are, how complex they are. Do they have shrub undergrowth? But they just put up, I think it was a few months ago, something called Icarus. And this is a new sensor that sits on the space station, and it's listening into signals of these fairly small devices that we're putting on migratory animals that not only report their position sort of every minute or every second, whatever you want, but they also record various environmental conditions like temperature, wind speed, and all that. So it's kind of revolutionizing how we can actually monitor wildlife. And you can put these things on locusts. So we can actually now monitor and predict locust swarms using Icarus to see how locust swarms might be coming through Eastern Africa with these devices. And this is just an example of a device for Icarus going on a flying fox or a fruit bat. And so this device is actually talking to that instrument on the space station. And then, of course, camera traps are another one. So hopefully, if I jump to this website, you'll see this. So what we're doing here is there's now thousands and thousands of camera traps all around the world. And for the most part, they were never coordinated. And now we have a central database that actually takes camera trap images. So that's called Wildlife Insights. And these are snow leopards. And collects all that information and organizes it around the world. So we basically have these sensors, especially in tropical areas, that can actually give you some level of measure of whether vertebrate species like mammals are increasing or decreasing in number. Sorry, I've been talking so much today, I'm losing my voice. So then the next thing is Bio-Acoustics. So this is kind of a really cool new approach. So you might want to turn your speakers up on this. So especially in places like Colombia, Borneo, really diverse areas of the planet, we're putting bioacoustic sensors down that basically just listen to the sounds in the forest, and they record those as sonograms. And now we use cloud computing to train those algorithms to determine what species you're actually listening to. So before we used to do things like point counts for birds, and you still do those, but we're getting to the point where you actually don't need a human to count those birds. You can use a bioacoustic sensor to do this. So this is just a recording in the Bornean rainforest. So I'll play this for you. Fine. So those what you were listening to were various Bornean tropical frogs, which if you were in the Bornean rainforest at night, they'd be pretty hard to find. But we can use sonograms now to actually listen in and determine what species are found there. And you can actually use sonograms and bioacoustic sensors to look to listen in, especially in forest habitats, to basically determine whether those forest habitats are getting louder or quieter over time. And sadly, of course, a lot of these habitats are getting quieter as we lose species. Oh, go to the next slide. So then, of course, we use more traditional techniques like mist nets for catching birds and bats. So this is a friend of mine in Colombia. We were down there mist netting at night, leaf-nosed bats. And so these are, mist nets have been around for decades, but they're still a really effective way because you sometimes need to actually handle that animal and measure it, take blood, put a radio on it, whatever, to learn a bit more. And in places like Colombia, which are incredibly mega diverse, I mean, you just get such a sheer diversity of bat species. And some of the bats we got in the nets, nobody knew what species they were. They were just, and we caught a screech owl that there had only been 3 records of for the time. So these areas are just mind-blowingly complex. And sometimes you just got to go out and put a net up and see what you get. But we also, when we sort of step back to look at how we actually understand patterns of diversity of life across the planet, we have up until recently really relied on museums. So you can think of these explorers in the 1800s that would go out and shoot everything, bring it back to England, document it, describe it. Charles Darwin, many others that have done this. And museums around the world, like the Natural History Museum in London, the Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, have huge natural history collections. And most, if not all of those collections have now been digitized. So we have digital records of, we found this species in 1902 at this particular location. And we can use that data to look at like, how has life changed over the last 100 years? Now this animation probably needs a bit of, I'll pause it actually before I go through this. So I just wanted to show a sense of how things have changed so rapidly. So this animation is going to start in around 1900, and it's basically giving you a sense of how many records have been digitized in that year, coming from different sources. So NMNH is just the National Museum of Natural History in the US, and then New York Botanical Gardens, the Field Museum, American Natural History Museum, and so on and so forth. So I'll just start running it. And note down here, eBird. Now, of course, eBird never existed in the year 1900, but eBird has digital records that people have uploaded from back then. So that's why it's there. But just watch what happens. So as you can see, in the early years, we rely heavily on natural history museum collections. But watch what happens. Particularly, take a look, keep a close eye on the green bar, which is eBird, and then another one, iNaturalist, which will come up. But as you can see over time, the race changes, and we start to see some big players in terms of data. And so here's eBird, now far exceeding all other collection sources for data. And eBird is simply birders that go out and observe birds and upload that onto the Cornell site. And it's just incredible how much data they've got. And in third place is Inaturalist, which is another really cool app coming out of the California Academy of Sciences, which you might have used or heard about. If you haven't used it, I highly recommend you download it. It's free. It's a really cool app, and I'll talk a little bit about this. But basically, citizen science records now outweigh just about everything else. So we really rely on just local people that are really keen on nature to collect useful data. So maybe everyone knows about iNaturalist, but this is created by a friend of mine at Cal Academy. And how it started out was, it was kind of like following in the steps of eBird, where you go out, you take a picture of something like a plant or an insect, you would upload it, and because your smartphone has a GPS, it would say where it was uploaded. And then you would either say what you thought it was, and have some experts confirm that. Or if you didn't know what it was, you just uploaded it, and some experts, often from museums, would go on and say, oh, well, that's a shark-eyed snail or whatever. And it was really cool because you would learn about that. And I use it all the time around here just to learn, like, what is this plant? I have no idea what this bug. But now it's arguably become cooler because now they use image recognition software. So in areas where there's lots of observations, like in Nova Scotia, more times than not, when you take a picture of a plant or an insect or a bird, the cloud computing and the image recognition is going to come back and tell you what that species is. And it's really, really accurate. So basically, you get an answer right away. And so it sort of fills your curiosity, but you've actually collected a data record for science. And so what happens with that data? So when you go out and take an eBird, upload an eBird observation, I saw an American robin, or you take an iNaturalist observation, once it reaches research grade, then it goes into something called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or what we call GBIF. And GBIF is, the headquarters is in Copenhagen, Denmark, but there's GBIF offices all around the world, including in Canada. And so when you upload a record, once 3 people have confirmed it, it becomes research grade, and it goes into this massive database. And this is just the heat map of about 1.5 billion species records that's housed in GBIF as of, I think, May 1st. So as of May 1st this year, they had just around 1.4 billion. I haven't checked lately, but I'm sure it's over 1.5 billion species records. And we use this all the time. And I'll show you a little bit how we use this. So at first, GBIF records came from research. So biologists going out and studying like wood turtles, and they'd upload their data maybe a year later. But more and more now, the majority of GBIF records are coming from things like eBird, iNaturalist, and other sources of fairly big data collections that get uploaded onto this platform. And it's free to upload. It's free to download. You can go onto GBIF right now and extract millions of records if you wanted to. And people do that all the time for research needs. And so again, you can use iNaturalist to record an observation. Once it's been validated by 2-3 users, it becomes research grade, and it goes on to GBIF. So that's kind of how it works. So I'm just pointing this out because these are really cool tools that you don't have to be a scientist, but you can be a scientist. Scientists use this all the time. I use this all the time, but just school kids, anybody can actually collect really useful data. So let's talk about what you can do with all this data. So with GBIF records, there's about, I'm guessing, at least 5,000 scientific publications that have come out of using GBIF data. And so we can do things like look at like how well do the current protected areas around the planet cover endemic species or threatened or endangered species. Just by using, basically you can compile big data to actually answer those questions. We use it to identify invasive species risk and where invasive species might be coming in. There's people that actually use it to to get a better handle on food security issues. We use it for modeling habitat suitability and how that might change with climate change. And we also use it actually to predict disease risk from zoonotic diseases, so from animal diseases that spill over to humans. So this is just a snapshot of a platform that my team at NatureServe just finished developing. So this is actually the coast of Vietnam. So we built what we call a biodiversity dashboard for Southeast Asia. And what you can do there is take all this different data sources, these global data sets, along with national data sets, and visualize them on these platforms. And you can start to do some sort of on-the-fly analysis where you can look at, like, how well does Vietnam's protected area network cover threatened and endangered amphibian species or mammals or so on and so forth. So you can start to really aggregate and overlay data to really inform smarter conservation policy in this part of the world. And we've done this to actually predict pandemic outbreaks. So this was published in 2017, and we probably should have taken it a little bit more seriously. But anyways, so basically, the ecology of zoonotic diseases is super fascinating, and it's really complex. It involves like human behavior, animal behavior, epidemiology, climate factors, all sorts of different things that play into this. But if you could kind of dumb it down or boil it down, the rough rule of thumb is that your risk of a zoonotic spillover event is highest in areas where you have a high diversity of mammals, in the same areas where you have a lot of people, high density of people, undergoing rapid land use change. And so this map was produced based on just basically those three variables to show areas of high risk. So places like Nigeria, the Niger Delta down here, India, Southeast Asia, and China. And if you talk to anyone in the know, it's absolutely no surprise that this COVID-19 outbreak has occurred. It was only a matter of time. And if you actually look at animal disease outbreaks in humans, the frequency of them is going up. And that's simply because we are encroaching on habitat that used to be somewhat secure, and exposing ourselves to viruses. And as exposure goes up, viruses become more contagious because they actually evolve very quickly. And if you're a virus, if you're highly contagious and you're highly deadly, it's a really bad, if your transmission rate is really low and you're deadly, you're probably going to go extinct because you kill your host before you get a chance to jump to another human. And so when you actually increase human activity in previously wild areas, you're increasing transmission rates. And so these viruses become more deadly. They evolve very quickly to become more deadly. In most cases, they need an intermediate host. So it's hard, you can't get COVID-19 directly from a horseshoe bat. You have to get it from an intermediate host, which we think is this pangolin species. So we can use this type of data to really predict disease risk to humans, which is a huge issue. I think governments are finally realizing that actually what happens to nature matters, because we're talking trillions of dollars off the table, hundreds of thousands of people dying, everything's shut down, all because of somewhat unregulated wildlife markets in South China. And we can use this data also to run habitat suitability models and link that with climate change predictions. So there's something called Nipah virus, which is a virus that's, it's a Hendra virus. It's not a coronavirus, but it's found in fruit bats in Southeast Asia and in Australia. And it has an intermediate host. So the reservoir host is the fruit bat, the intermediate host is the pig. And in Southeast Asia, there's more and more pig farms cropping up in different wild areas. And these pigs are contracting the Nipah virus, which are then spilling over to humans. Now, the good news with Nipah virus is it seems to have trouble going from human to human. The bad news about Nipah is it's very deadly, so it has a really high mortality rate. And And health organizations are really worried about this because they're worried about it evolving to the point where it can transmit from human to human quickly and easily. And if that does, it's a real disaster. And so you get these continual outbreaks in Bangladesh and in southern China, northern Laos, Vietnam, places like that. But if we look at climate change, these fruit bat populations are likely to expand that carry these. So we can start to predict where disease risk might change over time. And I know I'm running short on time, so I'm almost done. Is this okay, Chad? Are we got enough time?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So this is eBird data. So this is data collected on barn swallows, and it's just absolutely incredible what you can do. So eBird out of Cornell University in New York can actually create these heat maps of relative abundance across different seasons. And they can also create these cool animations that really look at how the timing of migration of barn swallows occurs from South America to North America, and how that might be changing over time. And again, this is largely reliant on keen birders collecting this data. Sorry, that was a bit of a short animation. The other thing we can do with all this data is we can actually identify areas of biodiversity importance. So this is a map that NatureServe just released about half a year ago, where we took thousands of data points for various species throughout the US, and we created species distribution models to look at where their critical habitat is. And we were able to create this heat map to show where the highest density of at-risk species are in the United States, and how well protected or not protected they are. As you can see here, Southeast US has a high density of at-risk species with very little protection. So we can use sort of this data to really try and inform protected area policy, and we could do the same in Canada. And then finally, GBIF data is being used all the time for things like looking at how climate change might be threatening or contracting habitat of things like the endangered wood turtle, which is a species that occurs in Nova Scotia. So with that, I'll stop, but hopefully that was a good overview of kind of how data that's collected in Nova Scotia feeds up into global systems, and how you can actually then extract that data and combine it with other data to answer questions right here at home.
Wow. Thank you, Mike. That was an incredible talk. So many interesting things. I'm just kind of blown away at the power that modern technology and machine learning, our satellite networks have at capturing some of this biodiversity. So I think we will let the audience ask a few questions to Mike, and then we will hear from Cliff. Okay. So Lori asks, what is the biggest challenge you are experiencing with collaboration in this scale?
Oh, that's a good, really timely question and a great one. So we were just talking about this on the call I just had, where we were electing new co-chairs for this global network. So the biggest challenge that we have is, I was hoping that when I started working in this field, that every country around the world would make decisions concerning biodiversity in the same way. So I'm working in Colombia, and I'm also working in Ghana and Uganda. And I was hoping that it would be a one-size-fits-all type situation where we could give them tools for collecting data and using data that would help them make better conservation decisions, or help the transport sector avoid areas of high concentration of species. But the sad thing is that all these countries are completely different. They're completely different in terms of their governance structures, in terms of the culture behind them, how they make decisions, and so on and so forth. So I think the biggest challenge we have as a global network is, how do you create useful on-the-ground products? We can do that like with technology for how you actually collect a species record. But to help a government make a decision is you really have to get into those countries and work directly with them. So right now I got this project in Ghana and Uganda where we're having to work closely with the institutions to sort of train them up on how they can actually use these global data sets to use. And you can't really, I was hoping you could just then give that to the next country and the next country, but because I'm lazy, but of course you can't. You have to really help each country one at a time. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think Lori says yes. So Anna is expressing, well, first she wants to thank you, and she says it's a shame more people couldn't join tonight because what you were saying is so important.
Thanks, Anna.
And from Rachel, she said, really great talk. Thank you. I love Inaturalist. I'm interested in learning more about GeoBond. Are there any researchers inputting data into it in Canada?
Yeah, well, so GeoBond's an open network, so anybody can actually join GeoBond, although it's pretty technical stuff. So it's a bit like watching paint dry to join one of the meetings, but it is an open network with an open meeting structure. Anyone can join the meetings. So if you go to geobond.org, you'll learn more about the network, but you can actually also look to see what our membership is in Canada. But we actually have a lot of people involved in Canada, all the way from this province over to BC. So there's quite a few folks. So at the University of British Columbia, a fellow there, he co-chairs a remote sensing task force. McGill University has just won the bid to host the new secretariat for GeoBond. So in Montreal, thanks, Chad, for putting that on. So the actual lead of GeoBond is now transferring from Germany to Montreal. There's a lot of researchers involved in GeoBond and in inputting data into these global data sets. Too many to name.
Can you hear me, Todd and Mike?
Yes,
yeah, I can hear you, Cliff.
Okay, very interesting presentation. I'm amazed somewhat. For around 15 years, I worked on loan from Parks Canada with the Smithsonian MAB group, putting in biodiversity plots around the world in different places, and also presenting a course in Virginia every year to people from around the world, young professionals. And we were using the sort of the plot-based monitoring approach to collecting all taxa data to increase the understanding and the inventory and understanding of how ecosystems work. So it was sort of at the other end of the scale from what you're doing, but yet seems there's a good connection. What I'd like to do is get your phone number at some point so that I could contact you in relation to the project that I'll be talking about, the Science Atlas project.
Yeah, for sure. So I assume your work, those are the man and the biosphere plots, those Smithsonian plots. Yeah. I mean, nothing. I mean, one thing that I should probably be more careful about in these presentations is a lot of people think that remotely sensed data is a panacea. Like if it's coming from a satellite, it's great. Actually, usually it's garbage. So for example, like in Ghana, we're doing these spatial biodiversity assessments for the whole country. And we've been using the European Space Agency global land cover maps. And when you actually apply them in Ghana, they're usually wrong. So you need people to actually be ground truthing them. You need plot data that actually translates what that spectral signal is to actually say, what does this really mean? And it's amazing how often we get it wrong. So we'll call shrubland a farm or a farm shrubland, for instance, or we'll call an area forested when it's not. So all that to say is we really need boots on the ground. And in fact, I'm often arguing that the space governments they love to throw spaceborne sensors into near low Earth orbit, but it costs like, $500 million to $1 billion. And, if we could just get them to not deploy one of those and put that money into people on the ground, like people at the Mersey Tobiatic Research Institute, it would go a long way. And we produce just as good data, if not better. But anyways, Cliff, yeah, I'll send you my phone number I'll do it in the direct chat to you.
That's great. Okay. Thanks. Well, you're muted, Chad.
You're muted there, Chad.
Oh,
there you go.
Thank you. So Jane says, thank you very much. Really super presentation. But her question is kind of like Lori's. But in Southwest Nova Scotia, we have a conservation collaborative working on ecosystem-based conservation projects, but our focus is very local. And she asks, how can we best contribute to the global network? Can we rely on federal channels to make this happen?
Okay. Yeah, good question. Well, I would say the most important thing is that I need to learn more about the specific project, but what we're always trying to encourage is that people follow some very basic standards to data collection. So that the most important one is called Darwin Core. So if you're doing a conservation project in Southwest Nova Scotia that involves species records, so Blanding's turtles, ribbon snakes, whatever it is, how that data is actually recorded should follow what we call the Darwin Core standard. And if you do that, then it can be easily published up into the Global Biodiversity Information Facilities system. So that's a way to kind of streamline your work and make sure it doesn't just have impact for Southwest Nova Scotia, but you're contributing to that global commons. But likewise, before I answer the federal channel side of things, likewise, I really think, as important as that is, I think it's more important that we actually use these global data sets to drive local research. Because let's face it, the battle is won or lost at local scales. Despite all these global forcings, it's really like, what do you and I or anybody else on this call have any real impact? And it's really on the ground doing the kind of work you're doing in Southwest Nova Scotia. So I would actually be open to accessing through these global data sets and platforms data that actually might strengthen your own research in Southwest Nova Scotia, because there's a ton of data that's available that could be integrated in your part of the world to help with your own work. But again, it depends on what it is. And in terms of the federal channels, I mean, the federal government is a big player in the group on Earth observations, and they've signed on to an open data policy. So they are pushing hard on open data. However, I might get this wrong, but I think that sometimes it's easier just to contribute directly to the global network than going through an intermediary like a federal government. Because if you give your if you give your data to the federal government, I'm not saying you shouldn't. So if it's, say, Environment Canada, maybe you've got species at risk data, you should definitely give that to the Canadian Wildlife Service. But if you're only doing it so that the CWS will give it to GBIF, you're probably disappointed. So you're better off actually doing that directly to GBIF. I don't know if it's a bit complicated, but there are ways that, and I could talk to you afterwards. I'd have to understand your project a little bit more, but it'd be fairly easy, I think, once I knew what kind of data you were collecting, what's the right channels to contribute that.
Okay, so I think before we get any more questions, we will give Cliff a chance to give his talk, and then we can circle back because there's lots of questions here.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Okay, am I up? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I certainly don't have the polished presentation that Mike presented, which was excellent. But I'll just give you an off-the-cuff, more or less, description of the Interactive Science Atlas project. Initially, as it applied to Southwestern Nova Scotia, the Southwest Nova Biosphere Reserve, and then how that is developing into a Nova Scotia-wide Interactive Science Atlas. You may be somewhat familiar with the objectives of biosphere reserves. Ours is interested in protecting biodiversity and also advancing science and education and sustainable resource management as sort of general principles. We have a zoning system which includes the corporate protected areas of National Park and the Tobiatic. crown land surrounding those core protected areas, which is used for forestry as well as research and monitoring and other activities, and then a zone of cooperation, which includes the communities basically around the coast and some in central Nova Scotia. The Science Atlas project actually came out of Kedjimpujuk National Park and National Historic Site in a way, and also the Smithsonian, in that from two aspects. First of all, I was an ecologist at Kedjimpujuk for 25 some years. And one of the tasks that we were given was to develop a resource atlas, or a resource description and analysis, as it was called. And was a compendium document that included information on the ecosystem, going right from the atmosphere to water, geology, soils, geomorphology, up through vegetation and wildlife species. And it included maps where we had them, and also lists off research that had been carried out in Kedjimpujuk National Park on those particular topics. And we found that to be a very useful tool, because you could check back also and get an understanding, and our staff could get an understanding of what the species were that existed in the park, and also the other physical characteristics, but also you could find out relatively quickly what research had been done. So that was one aspect of where the Science Atlas concept came from, this hierarchical ecological description of the park. The other aspect came out of the Smithsonian biodiversity monitoring plot, in a way, in that's a georeference plot, a grid that maps tree species down to 4 centimeters dBH. And at Kedji, we started the process of doing all taxa monitoring. And in that context, you start thinking about a data cube, if you will. So tracking microclimate along with, say, microinvertebrates and bird species in that area, and the status of trees and tree growth and mortality. You can start to theoretically get an understanding of how each aspect of the ecosystem might be relating to the other. Now, tie that in with the global expertise that the Nova Scotia Centre of Geographic Science has, and they're located in Lawrence and Middleton. Their expertise is in information management and geographic information systems applications. And so they, working with folks like David Coville and Bill Livingston and Ian Manning and myself and a few other team members, we came up with the idea of developing a digital science atlas that would be interactive, that would port out to other websites that included information on the different levels in the ecosystem. So, for instance, Kedji is well known for its long-range transport of air pollutants Katmon site, and so they monitor the atmosphere. So there's a valuable set of data that's coming out of that. NTRI and the park itself and other organizations are monitoring water quality, and again, things like Inaturalist and such are feeding in data. All our universities are carrying out research in the area and such. So we identified the challenge of saying, well, how do we capture that information and that data in a way that allows the potential for relational analysis of data sets one to the other, and also placing information in a geographic context. So in other words, not only are we looking at temporal data, but also spatial data, and starting to pursue the concept of the data cube initially for the Southwest Nova Biosphere region. We introduced this to some educators, this tool to some educators, and asked what they thought of it. And they seem to be very enthusiastic that it could be a tool that could be used in the classroom. So we approached Nova Scotia Department of Education and Early Childhood Development, and in fact, they were very supportive and have given us funds to support developing a Nova Scotia-wide interactive science atlas. And now that's kind of, the atlas, and I recommend you look at the Southwest Nova Biosphere Region website. That's www.swnnovabiosphere.ca, and you can access the interactive science atlas for the Biosphere Reserve. But that gives a description using other people's accessing other people's websites, and also embedded text of sort of the different ecosystem elements. So theoretically, a student could go through and learn about these different things. But there's another whole layer to the concept of the Science Atlas that we're working on. And that's based on the concept of distributed database system that ports out to different websites, around the province, and establishes a standardized method for documenting research and monitoring. And it's probably common to what Mike was talking about. Standard information management protocol, an abstract for a research study, metadata, which would include georeferencing and dates and times and locations and such. And then if there's an actual data set available for a piece of research that's been done, that a data dictionary be available, and of course, access to the data set itself. So how it would work is, in addition to the text that's embedded in the atlas itself, it might port out to MTRI's website, and you folks do a good job of listing the various research projects that you've done. And hopefully over time, you can record, and do record the basic metadata associated with those studies, and then indicating whether the actual data set is available to look at. We're thinking also of, and we're working on developing a rating system for different studies. If are those basic information management traits available? Is the data available? Is there a system if the person doesn't want to make the data available online? Can somebody be contacted so that they can be reached, so the researcher that's studying this thing can get access to that data? That system is an attempt to create, a distributed database data cube, so that you can then start layering information associated with monitoring and research, to look for, relational analysis. It also allows, if we focus specifically on listing Nova Scotia research from the universities, from the community colleges, from the NGOs, it then starts to allow the potential for gap analysis of research. So if you know what you got, then you can identify what you need. And then various agencies or organizations can start identifying those priorities for filling those gaps. So that's kind of the concept of the Interactive Science Atlas. It's an information piece based on the structure of the ecosystem, but also a tool to access distributed databases and capture and potentially improve the quality of research and data collection that's being carried out in a standardized form, so that then we can have that ability to do relational analysis and statistical evaluation, looking for trends that might not even be apparent right off the top, but when you start putting it through appropriate statistical program, you can start to see how things may or may not be in fact related to one another and responding to one another. An example of that might be changes in water chemistry versus changes in fish populations, or mineral like mercury values in fish or whatever. So that's where we're going with this. We're just in the process of, we've rounded up the money for phase one, and we're just in the process of negotiating the last terms of the contract with the Center of Geographic Science. There'll be two elements of it once the project starts: contacting all the various organizations, telling them about it, and then encouraging them to contribute, much like MTRI and CARP and we already do. In fact, Western Nova Scotia is the best, right? We got to stick together. And then the other aspect is and we're in the process of assembling educators, teachers, and curriculum specialists to look at this information. In fact, use the Southwest Nova Biosphere Science Atlas as a tool, look at that tool, and then develop student exercises that could be done, that could be used in the classroom at the high school level, maybe even in elementary school. There might be some possibilities. And even at the university level, we're working with Sean Craig at University St. Anne, looking at what might be done there. So that's where we stand. That's phase one. That has to be finished by March 31st of 2021. And then phase two will focus on expanding that Atlas concept to marine environments. So working with Department of Fisheries and Oceans and also Nova Scotia Environment and Fisheries to catch what data they have associated with their particular parts of the ecosystem, so that we can, in a similar fashion, be able to do relational analysis. And at the same time, challenge those organizations to come up with potential student exercises that can be fed into the education system, so that the teachers have a living tool associated with the system. And I should mention the Center of Geographic Sciences agreed that they'll maintain this science atlas over time. So once it's built, they will maintain it. And that means, and the nice thing about it is, as various agencies update their research, because it's a distributed database system, the information gets updated automatically. We're just porting out to those different sites. So we're in phase two, we're looking at marine coastal environment, and enhancing the biodiversity element of the existing science atlas, which I think needs to be, certainly added to. And also, perhaps importantly, in the context of what some of Mike was talking about, developing a human ecology chapter. So looking at, what is the ecology of the human being in southwestern Nova Scotia in terms of the human footprint, if you will. What are some of the tools that we can use to solve problems associated with sustaining biodiversity or protecting biodiversity and advancing sustainable resource management, and things like environmental impact assessment forms, performance management, applying performance management to carrying out study activities. So giving the students in that particular chapter the tools that they can use to create classroom exercises. And that's actually what I used to do with the Smithsonian with people from around the world, is we get them to create hypothetical problems based on their own continents, and then get them to brainstorm and business plan what the solutions might be to solving those problems. And then we would, in the case of the Smithsonian work, we'd get them to make presentations, PowerPoint presentations. We'd have the World Bank and Conservation International, Smithsonian folks decide who did the best presentation, most sensible presentation, and the winner won a case of Canadian Moosehead beer. That was the prize for what we did back then. But the other aspect of the human ecology chapter that is important, and again, Mike brought it up, is the whole concept of epidemiology. And based on what you hear about these days, particularly in the United States, but I'm sure it's the case in other places, that the public doesn't understand epidemiology, the principles of epidemiology, including, the concept of exponential growth. People don't realize that how fast that can occur once it gets going. So there's all kinds of interesting opportunities for the students at the Center of Geographic Science to develop models to show that kind of thing, and also to port out to operations like GBIF that Mike is talking about. So in addition to getting access to local research, there might be ways to port out to these other sites for students to get a better perspective of what's going on globally. I guess the last thing I should mention is that the current Science Atlas for Southwest Nova has got a tab called Atlas Lite. And most of the Atlas, as it stands now, works on an iPad or a desktop computer, but not a smartphone. But Atlas Lite is designed to work on a smartphone, and what it does is it provides active geopositioning capability, something like Google Maps, if you will. But it also features layers of the ecosystem, forest cover, some sort of general stuff like crownline boundaries, drainage basins, layers. And that particular aspect of the atlas can be added to. You can add different, additional layers to that. What we're suggesting is that that's going to be important in addition to the rest of the atlas for farmers and landowners and decision makers, that are associated with civic development, whatever, so they can actually go out in the field and be geolocated, and then put the layers on that they're interested in terms of the particular questions they might have. So we're very much focused on trying to make this a tool also for the average person that's either a landowner or manager or whatever. So that's kind of what we got and where we're going. We're quite excited. We've got representation now from MTRI and CARP and TRIPA. As I say, we want to make this a Western Nova Scotia initiative, because I think we've done a whole lot in Western Nova Scotia over the years, and so I think we can. We've got a good team that can help build this Nova Scotia Atlas, and I think everybody's quite excited about it. I just got to get the bureaucracy done and get the contract signed and get the wheels in motion. So that's, yeah. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to help. Do check out the Atlas on the Southwest Nova Biosphere website, though. Any comments are always valued about it.
And I did share the link to both your home website and the Atlas project in the chat bar.
Excellent. We think there's also, in the context of what Mike was talking about, we've been talking with the UNESCO folks, not only across Canada, but even in Europe. We think there's a global application for this, and the potential for it being exportable to other sites, the framework. So that's, perhaps phase 3 is how we might migrate the technology associated with this approach, the data cube and the distributed database concept, to a broader audience.
Okay. Thank you, Cliff. That's really interesting. So much to think about.
Can I ask a question? Is
yeah,
that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So Cliff, so at the Center of Geomatics Science, they use Esri, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So that's and it looks like your interactive science atlas is Esri based.
It's a story map function of Esri that Esri produces.
It is. Oh, it's story map. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah. So it might be. I put in the chat. It might be worth looking at the Esri's ArcGIS Living Atlas project, because you might be able to you might actually be able to link what you're doing to that. But there might be some sort of baked in functionalities. So, like Esri's AGOL environment now, they're trying to streamline things. It's a bit buggy still, but you could probably lower the programming load by working through that system, especially if COGS already has an enterprise license, which I'm sure they do. Yeah.
Okay, so Rachel has a question. She says the Atlas project sounds really interesting. If someone has research they conducted in Southwest Nova Scotia, who would be the best person to contact for contributing that information?
Is the work being done through MTRI or one of the NGOs, or through the university, or affiliation?
Hi. It's being done through universities.
Okay. And yes, what we're exploring, we've got a chap in Dalhousie now, and also Sean Craig at University of St. Anne, is through the Atlas getting access to the databases of the universities. So in other words, we would port out to Dalhousie University, and that would access their search engine for their research and find the listed research. Now, the question we have is, are the universities recording their research using standard information management protocols, right? Including, abstract, metadata data dictionaries. And are they attaching the data sets associated with that study that you're doing, whether it be a master's or PhD or whatever, are they attaching that with the report? It's either accessible, or if not directly accessible, can we then ask permission to prompt you and ask you for a copy of your data?
Right. So I guess the research I'm thinking
permission.
Yeah. Okay. I just know there's a lot of research that's going on with forested wetlands in the Southwest area that I've been part of, and a lot will be coming out soon with being published. So I wasn't sure how that could help with this.
Yeah, that's one way. As I say, are the universities publishing all of their students' research? And similarly with agencies, and some do and some don't, but the whole concept of open science, open data is to encourage agencies and institutions to make their data available as much as possible. Now, obviously, we can't, make available, nesting sites for blandings turtles. You don't want to do that. But there's a lot of other data that could be made available. Also, particularly important is, and this is something we set up at Ecology back when, because that's kind of where some of this comes from, is that when any study is done, we required the researchers in Ecology National Park had a research permit, and we then required them to register their project, including the methodology, in such a fashion that it could be repeated again in the future, ideally, so that it could serve as a monitoring function in the long term. Research is one thing, monitoring is another one, and monitoring is critical because that's not just a snapshot. That's tracking change over time, and that's important in the field of ecology, and particularly these days with climate change and all these other variables that are affecting the system. And if you want to put your report on the MTRI website as well as the university, that's great too.
Okay, well, if no one has any more questions, I would like to thank Mike and Cliff again for exceptional talks this evening. So much to think about and process. It's great. I'd also like to thank the Region of Queens for supporting our seminars, as well as Venture for Canada for supporting my work here at MTRI. And thank you to everyone for joining us, and we hope you see you soon on November 12th for our next seminar, our Lunch and Learn, where we'll be talking about how our noisy modern society is impacting bird species. And if you'd like to join, you can use the exact same Zoom link that you used tonight, and we hope to see you soon.